Good afternoon and welcome to the Council. I'm your host, Charlie Pacello. And folks, we have a very special series that we are inaugurating today on the Council. It's called the Veteran Summit Series. And we have partnered up, the Council has partnered up in collaboration with the Trauma Sensitive Awareness Foundation to present this Veteran Summit Series. KUHS TV radio premieres part one of this Veteran Summit series with a special 10-part interview that provides veterans and their loved ones with information, hope, inspiration, and healing. It's going to be the first of its kind summit while exploring cutting-edge treatments and alternative therapies for PTS, TBI, moral injury, sleep disturbance, family conflict, emotional trauma, and so much more. We're going to be talking with mental health experts. Veterans and their advocates are going to be providing answers, resources, and solutions to bring all of our warriors home. We're starting the dialogue today. Come and join the conversation. We're going to learn a lot in these next 10 weeks, and part two is going to be debuting in November. So tune in every Friday here at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, all the way through September 25th here on KUHSdenver.com. We are the stream, KUHS. We are broadcasting live here in Denver, Colorado, and to all parts of our country, all around the world. We're being listened to by over 40 different countries here on the Council. It is an honor and a privilege to be your host, and I can't wait to begin to speak to you about what today's topic means to me. As a veteran, I've been touched by PTSD and a complex PTSD, and my family has been in service in our nation for generations. They go back all the way to the Revolutionary time. We certainly had a lot of ancestors who fought in the Civil War and in every major conflict, and so veterans are very important to me. Their healing, their restoration, their dignity, their sacrifice, their courage, their resiliency, and their woundedness is something that has been a part of me and our family for a very long time. And when I was asked to do this program, I was very humbled by the opportunity and to be able to give to you something that can save your life and save veterans' lives and their loved ones' lives and people who understand and are dedicated to helping the population, the society, the culture, the veteran community, and others know what's available out there to help you to recover and heal from those invisible wounds, the traumas that you may have experienced, and to share your stories in meaningful ways. One of the greatest healings, and I think we'll be talking about it later today, in this conversation, is about the power of storytelling and how sharing our stories in meaningful ways can really make a difference and to be able to unlock our secrets so that we don't stay sick. It's our secrets that keep us sick. And when we think that I was sharing with Kevin here just earlier, I had been dealing with so much trauma from my experience that it wasn't until I had reached a crisis point that I was forced to decide whether or not I needed to share my story or keep it in, and if I kept it in, I wasn't going to make it. We want to get you to a point where you're not having to reach that crisis point, that you can do it beforehand, that you can heal yourself mentally and emotionally, spiritually and physically from these wounds so that you can be better for your families, your friends, your communities, and for our nation, and that your stories help us to grow as a nation, to become wiser, better, and healthier. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you my very esteemed and honored guest. He is an award-winning backpack journalist and author. His name's Kevin Sites. He traded a high-profile career as a network news producer and correspondent for ABC, NBC, and CNN to become the first internet correspondent for Yahoo News. In his groundbreaking Hot Zone project, he covered nearly every war in the world in 1 year, earning multiple awards, including the 2006 Daniel Pearl Award for Courage and Integrity in Journalism. He is the author of 3 books on war, all published by HarperCollins imprint, Harper Perennial. They include Swimming with Warlords, a dozen-year journey across the Afghan war, In the Hot Zone, 1 Man, 1 Year, 20 Wars, and The Things They Cannot Say, stories soldiers won't tell you about what they've seen, done, or failed to do in war, of which he recently narrated a digital audio version for recorded books. In 2010, Sites was chosen as a Nieman Journalist Fellow at Harvard University, and in 2012, he was selected as a Dart Fellow in Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. He's currently an Associate Professor of Practice at the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong, as well as contributor to many print and online publications, including Vice Magazine, Aeon, Men's Health, Parade, and Salon. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Charlie.
Kevin, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and to talk to us about this incredible book that you wrote, The Things That They Cannot Say. But before we get into that, could you share just a little bit with our audience, a little bit about your background and how you became a backpack journalist?
Sure. Well, I think I'm one of those rare individuals that knew what they wanted to do from the time that they were very young. There were kind of 2 career paths for me. One was to be a starting guard for the Los Angeles Lakers. That didn't work out very well. I don't even think I made it through JV basketball. And the other was to be a foreign correspondent, to actually work as a journalist. I wanted to tell other people's stories, and that worked out a little bit better. My very first job was as a photographer for my hometown newspaper. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio and got a camera for Christmas, begged my parents for it. Wasn't very good with it initially, but I practiced, and then I took a portfolio down to the local newspaper, and surprisingly they hired me, and that was the start. But I've always been an introvert, and it's interesting to be drawn to a profession where you have to deal with people, pretty much all the time. You have to go beyond that. You have to get their stories. And that's the part that intrigued me, understanding their stories. Mm-hmm. And so doing that meant engaging. And so, initially working in print, and that wasn't a problem. Even working in radio, you're not carrying a lot of equipment. But when I transitioned into television, you're working with a whole crew, and I was a producer. So normally when I went out on a shoot, I had a correspondent, I had a camera person, I had an audio person, and myself. And so, you're a small gang going out and talking to an individual, and it's not the best way to get a story. When you want to have an intimate conversation, it's usually, you and another person talking quietly somewhere and trying to be authentic and understanding each other. When you bring a whole television crew, it changes the dynamic of the story. It changes how people present themselves. It makes them, in some cases, very uncomfortable. In other cases, it turns them into a public relations professional, and in either case, you're not quite getting the truth. So for me, there was a big desire to kind of revert back to what I had as a print journalist, which was that intimacy and talking with the source. And so the only way I could do that was really to learn to shoot and to edit and produce and transmit my stories on my own. And I was fortunate enough to kind of be on my career path during that time where a digital revolution was happening, where the equipment was getting smaller, where we were able to tell stories, even complicated television stories, alone, without a crew. And I was working in a field, I didn't choose to do conflict coverage, it just kind of happened. We all know America has gone to war quite a bit. Mm-hmm. When I joined the network, we were just kind of beginning, some of the issues that we had with Iraq. We were incorporating the no-fly zone in Iraq following the first Gulf War. And I got sent to cover that, and eventually got sent to cover the war in Kosovo, Afghanistan, 9/11 happened, and Iraq. And so I didn't choose to cover war, it just kind of happened. And while I was there, I realized that if I could learn how to master these skills on my own, I could probably get a better story. And eventually, I was on my own at one point in Afghanistan, on the front lines. I had a crew at the time, but I wasn't with them, and I had my own camera, and I captured a battle between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance fighters that the U.S. was supporting. And it was a time period when really the first casualty of that war happened, and it wasn't a soldier on either side. It was an American journalist, a National Geographic producer, and he got hit with a Taliban mortar shell. I captured that, and it became kind of a powerful image, series of images. And what was interesting about it is that very often when you see war coverage, you see outgoing fire. People firing out, but you don't see the results of it. You don't see hot metal hitting soft human flesh and the blood that results from that. And I captured that. In fact, I can show that clip to you later if you want to see it. But that was my first foray as a backpack journalist, and I realized that without the crew, being on my own, I could get powerful stories and I could transmit them because of the new technology that we had. And that's what happened. And the audience is more forgiving when you're covering conflict, when you're covering something that doesn't need to look, beautiful. You're not working for a magazine show where you're expecting the interviews to be incredibly polished and well lit and so on. Mm-hmm. You're covering something that's fairly gritty. So the viewers, the audience were, accepting of that.
Well, I think it's so unique and unusual format in being able to really get into it, because I think, like you said, you pointed out, when you got the cameras on front of you, and it's very difficult, and you got the lights and you got the whole crew that's around you, it's really difficult and hard to be vulnerable and authentic and real and in the moment kind of a thing, because all of a sudden I don't know why it happens, but it does, where you just come on and you start putting on, your presentation, and you got to be in presenter mode, and it's not necessarily the truth. And I think what's so wonderful about your work and the videos that I have seen is you have a commitment and dedication to the truth, like a journalistic integrity towards the truth of the things and how they really are, not what we want them to be, but how they really are. And because a lot of times we have it in our mind about the way certain things we think war is, certain way we think, I mean, when I was in the military, we thought, war was something that was, was something that you kind of thought was something you wanted to do. You almost hoped that you could kind of go to war because you wanted to be like your forefathers. You wanted to be like your dad. You wanted to be like your grandfather and to do those things. And so there was almost a part of us that glorified it. But the reality of it is so much different. Do you think, in our understanding of war, I mean, you didn't choose to become a war correspondent, but were you seduced by war, even as it was, the drums were beating and the sabers were rattling? I mean, was it familiar to you in that way, like it is to a lot of veterans?
Without a doubt. And in fact, I grew up playing Army like a lot of young men, some women, young women. We thought that was the most fun we could possibly have in our backyards and with our toy guns and so on. And as a journalist, it's not so different. Part of how you earn your street cred is, have you gone to war? Have you covered conflict? It's become remarkably easy. We can cover conflict in our backyard these days. You don't have to go very far, but yes, it was something that I wanted to do very early on. And early in my career, the first conflict that I actually covered was I went to Nicaragua. The U.S. at the time was funding the Contras, the Sandinista Contras against the Sandinista government, and I went and I covered that, and it was eye-opening, just to see the geopolitical sphere playing out in our own backyard in a very small part of Central America. And it did seduce me. One of the earliest memories that I have from that conflict was I was working with a Canadian military professor at the time, and we were traveling together, and we picked up a couple of Sandinista soldiers when we were driving back from a battle site in a mountain pass, and they got into our vehicle. They were hitchhiking, and I could smell the campfire on them. It was the first time I saw an AK-47 close up, and it was powerful. It was just the imagery of it, and you could see how, in some ways, we as journalists have also been seduced by conflict. Much of our focus has to do with combat. And what I learned when I did the Hot Zone project, something that you mentioned earlier in my introduction, where I covered all the wars that were happening in the world at the same in 1 year, was that combat is a very small portion of conflict. In fact, it's probably the smallest portion. It's expensive. It doesn't happen that often. When it does, it's not necessarily soldiers that are always dying. Our conflicts, even the early conflicts, the ancient battles that we see, even Napoleon and Waterloo and so on, you have these armies amassing across from each other, but it's civilians that die in the greatest number. They don't die on that battlefield at that time. They die from sexual violence. They die from disease. They die from starvation because the land that was meant to be growing food, can no longer do that. And that's continued. That's continued to this day. And that's part of our seduction. And my goal as a journalist is, how do we cover war without the guns? How do we cover these battles, and try to understand them in a larger context? And that's what led to this book, The Things They Cannot Say, is I wanted to follow these warriors home from battle. What happened afterwards? What happened when the guns were put away? And quite sadly, the violence and the conflict doesn't stop when the battle ends. Maybe in some cases it's just beginning, as you know in your own case.
Oh my God, yes. I mean, that's so true. Because the war doesn't end just because you come home. And very often you are in such a hyper-vigilant state. You're in that survival mode. You're in that fight or flight response, and it is on active overdrive. You're running at 180 miles per hour, because you've got to be on point. You can't allow anybody around you to die. And the hardest thing, and I think, and we're going to get to the video here in just a moment, it's not about killing other people that the corporal says. It's about not getting killed yourself. And so you're in that intensity so much, and then when you come out of it, then it's like all of that stuff that hasn't been allowed to be processed comes bubbling up to the surface, and it can be overwhelming and self-destructive and isolating and alienating because of what you've experienced. And I think we brought up a point that I do want to hit on before we get into the video clips in the book, is about what war is. I mean, you have a first-hand experience from Nicaragua to Kosovo to Iraq and Afghanistan, so you've seen a lot of war. You've seen a lot of conflict. Do you think we as a country and as a society need to kind of reframe our ideas about war? Like you just said, a lot of people don't know that it's mostly civilians who die as a consequence of war, not the combatants, from starvation, from illness, from disease, from being in the wrong place at the wrong time. If people really truly knew the costs of war and its devastating impact on all those involved, Kevin, do you think we might be less inclined to use military force unless absolutely necessary?
I wish that were the case. I wish we were, using violence as a last resort, but we're not. In some cases, we're using it as a first resort. One of the things that started to make me very upset was, after coming out of, well, we haven't really even completely come out of them, but these decades-long conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were many voices supporting the notion of going to war with Iran. We're not even clear of them. And I know some of the individuals I talked about in my book, that I wrote about in my book, Tom Saul, he was a veteran of Vietnam, like your father, and experienced a lot of combat. And he suppressed it for so many years when he came back. He was a model teacher, but he was doing drugs and alcohol. But he said the thing that tipped him over was that kind of battle drums to go to war in Iraq, for no reason. And that's what spilled it for him. Made him come out and kind of embrace the trauma and the turmoil that he was feeling inside for so many years, and that had bottled up. And we continue to make that same mistake, and I think we do it because we glamorize war. Journalism is partly to blame for that, but so is our own ignorance, historically, of what happens in these conflicts. They're not necessarily about battles between soldiers anymore. They're battles between societies, and they're battles between individuals and small groups, and you can't win those kind of wars. You have to work them out, as frustrating as that is, in the sense of negotiation and sitting across from people that you disagree with. But it is much preferable to the idea of taking up arms and occupying them, because the long-term impact of this, the actual battle and the death that happens as an immediate result of it is so small and so fleeting. We looked at what happened with the Islamic State and the kind of post-Iraq battle that we saw happening in Syria and Iraq there, and it wasn't about territory. It wasn't about who owned it. It was about these historical wrongs that have been still taking place that have not been solved. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the Middle East was divvied up after World War I. There's so many factors involved, and if we continue to proceed in ignorance and willful ignorance, we're going to be constantly going to war. I think we probably will, unfortunately, not willing to do the hard work.
We're not willing to do the hard work, Kevin, and there are echoes from our past of people who have served in these major bloody battles and wars, from the Civil War to World War I. You had these poets were writing about the carnage and the suffering, and you would think that you would hear from these tales from the people who actually experienced it, that it would somehow penetrate into our consciousness, into our mind, into our heart, to really see, wow, why are we following this? Why are we doing this? But it doesn't seem to be happening. So.
I think that's such an important point, Charlie. I mean, there is such a rich resource of all kinds of history and poetry and art and drama and fiction and nonfiction that would help us to understand this. In fact, at HKU, I teach a course called Killing Stories, the search for truth in the narratives of war. And we look at all of those things, from the classics like Achilles and Odysseus and all of these tales up into modern stories like Oliver Stone's Platoon, and looking at what lessons they have to teach us. And I think part of the problem is, there is a glamorization of certain aspects of war, but there's also not a full embrace of why we do love it so much. What are the things about it from your service that you really enjoy? That camaraderie, that sense of purpose, that closeness and bonding with individuals that you may never have those kind of friendships again in your life, both because of the conflict that crystallized them, but because of the things and that shared sense of purpose. So we have to look at that. We have to look at the good things as well as the bad things, and embrace them, and not try to mythologize, aspects of it. It can't be these propaganda movies, the good guy always winning. And every military has its psychopaths. Every military has its rapists. There are heroes that do a good job, but there are plenty of people that don't, just like in every other profession. And I think that's something that we have to address, something that's out there.
Well, and I agree. And you were talking about some of the virtues of military service. There are so many, and that's one of the draws to it. And when you know that somebody is out there, the bond of somebody who's willing to stand up there and protect your life in the midst of almost being killed yourself, that bond that you have with that person is so strong. To give your life for somebody else is the greatest form of love, and that's one of the Judeo-Christian tenets. And so to have that, and not to be able to feel that kind of love for your brothers or your sisters, because they're willing to go there with you, we're coming back together, and you don't get that same kind of depth of feeling in the civilian world. It can throw you off a little bit, and that's why almost like you crave that camaraderie, that connection, those experiences again. And it's like we keep recycling it in order to get that experience of that deep bond of brotherly love and sisterly love that so many people experience in the combat zone.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's also how we get, we motivate young soldiers to kill. In my course, I call it the fatal feedback loop. You undergo this military training. Normally, in military terms, they call it, small unit cohesion, social cohesion. And that's the bond that you create from boot camp, on down. You experience hardship, you strip away all your individuality, you become a part of this group, and then they send you to war, and then the man on your left or right, or the woman on your left or right gets killed. You want to take revenge for that.
Oh, yeah.
You may have nothing against that Iraqi that you're fighting or that Afghan that you're fighting, But because you've lost someone, because you've lost a brother or a sister, you're willing to shoot back. Yeah. You know, S.L.A. Marshall, the historian, wrote about it in World War II. You know, only 15% of soldiers in World War II actually fired their weapon with the intent to kill.
Isn't that incredible? That's absolutely incredible. Can you say that again? It's 15%, right?
15% fired their weapons with the intent to kill. 75% did not. Wow. But we've overcome that. You know, in Vietnam, those numbers went up. You know, so.
Yep. We lost your sound. Kevin, the sound? Yeah. Just a moment, folks. We're having a...
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now. Yep, for sure.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that.
No, it's...
I'm using my daughter's portable microphone. So it's one of those situations where, you know, the military, the U.S. military addressed that problem, you know, where people were not firing their weapons. And there's a set of conditioning and training that goes into place now that has brought that number up. And part of it is, you know, the officer is controlling the tempo, telling you that this is your enemy. I'm giving you the authority to fire and to take that life. We're using silhouettes instead of paper or bullseye targets like we used in World War II. We're dehumanizing the enemy, using terms like take out the target, you know, take out, you know, this objective, rather than saying, you know, shoot that Iraqi or shoot that Afghan. You know, so it's a really interesting process, and that has changed quite a bit.
Well, the dehumanizing process is absolutely critical in being able, I think, in order to kill somebody else, they have to be an other. They have to be someone other than human. An enemy, you have to denigrate them. You have to bring them down to a level where it doesn't affect your conscience. I mean, it has to minimize in some way. But you can only do that so far, in my opinion. Kevin, you...
And so temporary, too.
Yeah, so temporary.
When you think about it, so we're using terms, you know, derogatory terms, you know, gook, slope, whatever was used in Vietnam, you know, Krauts for the Germans, and so on. So what happens when, you know, those nations, you know, need to rejoin the family of man? How do we change that perception? And, you know, I think, you know, that's one of the greatest problems that returning vets have, is that, you know, we're turning on this killing process for them when they go to war, and then asking them to turn it off when they come back. To look at someone as less than human, dehumanize them, disassociate them from their humanity, see them as an enemy, and then, you know, change that once they come back. And it is not something that can be done seamlessly by any means.
Oh no, and you know, and the more once you are cross that bridge, or cross that Rubicon and have dehumanized the enemy, then the perpetuation to do harm accelerates, and your willingness to commit atrocities, your willingness to do cruelties, the willingness to do horrible things, because that person is not a human being. And it's a slippery slope, and it's something that we all have to be aware of when we're asking our soldiers and our airmen and our sailors and our Marines to do these things. What are we asking them to do? We really need to have that conversation. And Kevin, I want to get to your book now, The Things They Cannot Say, because it's so compelling. It's absolutely phenomenal. I was riveted, moved. It was heartbreaking, eye-opening, honest, and exposes a lot of truths. And I think you've done something remarkable here in being able to really get into the mindset, the heart and minds of what's really going on inside of the veteran, and being able to see what's inside them. And one of your first stories in the book is about Corporal William Wald. Could you share his story with us, please?
Sure. Willie Wald was a Marine corporal, grew up in Vancouver, Washington, and just, you know, a dynamic, charismatic young man who I met in Fallujah, really while the Second Battle of Fallujah was happening in November of 2004. And when I met him, he was out on the streets after having just killed 6 men. He had been inside a mosque where, you know, there were armed Iraqi insurgents. And up until that time point, the American military had decided that they were not going to fight or fire back when they were taking. Sorry about that. When they were getting outside, some type of opposition from mosques. And so what they would do is they would avoid it. They would kind of control the area, but they wouldn't fire back into it. In Fallujah, they changed that, and they decided if they took fire from mosques, they were going to fire back, regardless of the public relations problems that happened there. So they went into this mosque. Willie Wald opened a door to a storage room, and there were armed insurgents back there, and he fired. He killed 6 of them, and his men killed another 4 or so. So when I reached him, we were out on the streets, and he was just juiced from the adrenaline of that experience. And it's interesting. In my career, it's very difficult to interview soldiers and police officers, anyone that martial arts and the martial forces are part of what they do. They may not have processed it themselves, so they don't want to talk about that. Certainly not immediately after it happens, but very often not at all. Mm-hmm. And so, in this particular case, he had been willing to talk about it. He started sharing with me, really a thoughtful explanation of both what had just happened, the killing that he had to do, with his own hands, mm-hmm. but also his struggle to stay alive in that war zone, the struggle to maintain his humanity. And who was he going to be when he went back home, to be with his fiancée, to be with his mother, to be with his family? Was he going to be the same person? And even at that point, he didn't feel like he was. He felt that change, that transition inside himself. And I videotaped that whole kind of exchange, and I could share that with you and the viewers and listeners if we'd like to do this. And this conversation took place right outside the mosque.
Well, I would very much like to do that, because I think it's important for people. It is so raw and it is so real and genuine in the moment of battle, and I think it gives. We're talking about the costs of war, and here you are witnessing it happen to somebody right now in the moment. He's just finished killing 6 people, and now he's trying to get his guys through to finish their mission. But it's such an important thing. We need to see these things. We need to bear witness to them, and to hear them while it's happening. It's so important. So please, Kevin, go ahead and start the video for us, please.
Yeah, and Charlie, just to set this up for your viewers and your listeners, I cut this interview. It went on for about 30 minutes, but this was part of the trailer that I used for my book. So you'll hear some music. There's some text that appears in between the clips, but you'll hear mostly Willie Wald and partially my questions to him while we're on the streets of Fallujah.
I just want to be normal. I want to live a normal life. Do you think you can after this? I'm sure I'll be all right. This place it'll make you pretty hard. It'll give you some thick skin. Tired of that too. I kill it here, the less I gotta worry about coming into my country. I don't know if I can do another tour over here. The more time you spend here, the more people you want to kill. Right now, it's so sick of tearing out my body that it's gonna kill them all. The more time you spend here, the more time you just want to get in there and kill them. I hope so. I really do. My fiance's really worried I'm not going to come back the same. I'll never tell her what things I did here. I'll never tell anybody. I'm not proud of killing people. I'm just proud to serve my country. I never understood it until I got there. I can't stand it.
It's hard to give us.
It's not hard to kill people. It's hard not to get killed. My company's got so many casualties. It's not even funny.
Yeah, especially this event. That's a lot of casualties.
We're pushing! Hey, Doc, when you come up here, we got friendlies down here. Hey, we got friendlies down here. Hold up, hold up. Hey, listen up. We got friendlies down here to the south. You hear me? Keep your eye on the rooftops and get low. That's why our main objective. That's how we clear a house. That's how the Marines do it. No, we don't mess around. My first guy I was always worried about. My friend told me today, man, you were so worried about getting killed when you got it. And now, I don't have time to think about that shit. We bust into a house. Like today, I had people pointing AKs and saying, going less than 10 seconds. What you gotta do? Shit goes right out the window. How you talking?
I think it's so revealing, and just watching that clip and seeing him being in the moment of, it's like it hasn't even quite hit him yet what he's going through and what he has had to do, and he's, you know, it's so revealing. He says it's not hard to kill. It's not hard about killing somebody. It's hard not to get killed, and just being, you could feel. I mean, that is better than any movie I've ever seen about the intensity and the ferocity, the horror of war captured in video. I don't think I've ever seen something as moving to me, because movies they play it up a little bit, but this is real. This is raw. This is the truth.
Out of everything that I've ever shot in every conflict zone that I've ever been to, regardless of whether it was a battle or it was just an interview, this is probably the most powerful moment that I can remember, because he was being honest.
Yeah.
Really, he gave us a gift, and it's unusual. You know, we talked a little bit about how the TV camera or video camera changes things and changes the environment. You know, Willie Wald, what wasn't speaking to the camera, he was speaking to me or speaking to the world, and trying to make sense of whatever just happened in his life. And he changed forever at that moment. You know, he had actually changed earlier. This is a difficult postscript to this particular story, and you know, there's more to it, and it's more complicated, and I get into this in a chapter about him in the book. Mm-hmm. But this wasn't his first experience killing, you know, and unfortunately, the first experience that he had, the people he shot were not combatants. Mm-hmm. He was at a checkpoint at one of the bases. There was a vehicle coming at the checkpoint, and it wasn't stopping, despite the fact that you know, there were stop signs in both Arabic and English, and the people that were driving the vehicle were given signals to stop, and then his lieutenant told him to open fire on the. You know, the split-second decision he had to make. You know, he was given authority to do it from his lieutenant, and there were many times when, you know, VBIEDs, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, have been used to attack checkpoints and the openings of bases and things like that. And so this could have been one of the situations. And the Marines and most of the U.S. military have something in place called force protection, where they don't take a lot of risks with their soldiers if they don't have to. And so, the result is to fire and to stop the vehicle and then see what the situation is. And unfortunately, it was they were non-combatants. And so that stayed with Willie Wald, and then built up on his repertoire of war experiences, both good and bad, fighting the actual enemy, but also having, these innocent lives that he had taken by mistake. And so when he came home, he had a real struggle in recovering and readjusting to civilian life, as of course he would. And I spoke to his mother, for the book. And she told me that it all kind of came out on 4th of July, like it does for a lot of veterans.
Yeah,
when fireworks happen, I try to explain to my wife, I don't enjoy fireworks either on the 4th of July, and a lot of veterans don't, but you hear that, and it brings back a lot of memories. And, Willie Wald just kind of lost it at that point. So they spent a lot of money on psychiatrists, doctors, and so on. Found out that he had TBI, traumatic brain injury, as well as PTSD, and started using drugs that he was given by the VA, and drugs he started taking recreationally on his own or to self-medicate. And that got worse. And eventually, what he decided to do was to rejoin the Marines. He had been discharged honorably when he left Iraq, and he told his mother, "I got to go back. My brothers will take care of me." But at that point, he was such a mess. He was having such a difficult time adjusting. He had a drug addiction, and his mom told me he developed a stutter. And so, far from the respect that he would get from being a decorated war veteran, he was getting made fun of by other Marines. And it got so bad, and the Marines were able to see that he had a drug problem. Tried to get him help to kick it. He couldn't do it. And so they discharged him, and he was being kept at the Naval Medical Center in San Diego. And he was kept overnight, and he was going to be discharged the next day. A couple of his friends went in to see him. He asked them, did I take my medication already? And he apparently was forgetting what medication he was taking, what he wasn't. So he took it again in front of them. They had plans the next day to go camping. When they came back the next day, they found out he was in the same position they left him, and he had died from a drug overdose. It turns out he was taking methadone in addition to his other drugs that he was taking. So methadone is a depressant, and so it created respiratory arrest, while he was sleeping that night, and ended up dying on the Marine Corps' actual birthday, on the date of the Marine Corps' birthday. So. Yeah, a really sad kind of postscript, but not so
Oh, your sound, Kevin, just went off. Don't know sound. Nope, I don't know what happened to the sound here.
Is it back?
Nope, there it is. It's back now. Okay, sorry about that. We didn't have any signal. It was what you were saying was so good. I didn't want to interrupt you, and so yeah. Anyway, please go on.
So it's not so atypical of what happens, to other veterans. That they come back, they have difficulty adjusting. The only place that they feel normal is in a war zone. So certainly not, in the home front, despite the fact that they miss it terribly when they're in war. But there's no place they feel at home, anymore. Once they have those kind of experiences and they're not properly dealt with.
Yeah.
It puzzles me, and I was curious, why is this happening? Why are so many veterans committing suicide? Why are they not getting the help they need? And in my investigations and in the research that I was doing, I think part of the problem is that we as a society don't fully embrace their return. Yes. We thank you for your service. We want to buy you a beer and all those things, and yet if you're willing to actually try and tell us a story from a combat zone or wherever your military experience was, our eyes start to glaze over because it becomes a difficult process. And that creates a disconnect for the veteran. They think, we're not interested, or worse, we can't understand. And this is a key point that I make, Charlie, and something I think really needs to be addressed. There's a huge civilian-military divide. It happens whether we're in war or peace, but it becomes more acute when we're talking about the return of veterans, because in some ways we look at each other in very unrealistic terms. The military, especially active service, as much as they probably won't say this out loud, has contempt for civilian society. You're out there working hard, you're making sacrifices. You look at us and you think like, oh, you're sitting at home, watching movies on Netflix, eating popcorn and ice cream, and getting lazy, not worrying about what we're doing here.
Right. Everybody on their iPhones, that kind of stuff. Right.
Civilians assuage that guilt by deifying the military. Giving them godlike status. There's every person in the military is a hero. We have a fetish about it. We can't say anything bad about you. There's not one bad individual among the whole group. It's just nonsense. There are bad people in every profession, the military included, and we don't look at each other realistically. Contempt from the military for civilians, civilians looking at the military in this godlike way where we can't understand what you've been through. So that's nonsense, and the military buys into that. You don't know what it's like, you weren't there.
Right. That's what we say all the time. That's what we say.
All the time. And it's a bad excuse, but it's an understandable excuse. And the excuse happens for this reason. Civilians don't understand specifically what you've gone through militarily, if they haven't been in the military themselves or they haven't spent a lot of time in war zones. But they can understand the underlying factors that are part of that. Let me give you an example. Almost every woman in the world has experienced some form of sexual abuse or sexual violence. That creates post-traumatic stress. If they've been involved in actual rape or physical violence against themselves. Anyone in a car accident has experienced physical violence. It's not the same as shooting at someone or getting shot, but we can channel our understanding of those feelings to understand the military experience. If you're a black man in America, you know what the ambient threat of violence is to you almost every single day when you walk out your front door. So we in civilian society can understand what the military's gone through, not identically to your experience, but we're all human beings. We've all experienced threat of violence in some ways. We all experience fear. We all experience bad memories. We all experience making bad decisions.
Yes, we do.
So how do we come together in that mutual understanding and realize our experiences are different from yours, but it doesn't mean we can't understand the underlying feelings.
And it's also Kevin. It's also part of a broken social contract. We have a contract between the civilian world and the military. You're going out there to protect us. You're going out there to protect our freedoms and ideals and our way of life. And so you're in service to us. We put you out there, and now when you come back, it's our responsibility to take care of you, to embrace you, to get you healthy again, to listen to you, to hear your stories, and to take them back, and so that we can understand better what we put you through. Whether you agree with the wars or not, that's not the point. It's about our contract that we have with them, and recognizing that they're going to carry those wounds by themselves if we don't do our part as in the civilian world. And so there's a broken social contract, and it is perpetuated exactly by this idea that, one, from the military standpoint, you don't get us. You don't know what we've been through. You have no idea. I can't connect with you. So that leads to the alienation, the separation, the isolation that often happens, and then the deification of the military by the civilian population that we've mythologized. When wait a second, we need to hear the truth, just like we witnessed with Corporal Wald, and seeing the truth of what is actually happening and going, and having more of those kinds of conversations so that we can get a clearer picture of what we're putting our men and women through. And then to use that information to make better choices, better decisions on how we use the military in the future.
I mean, you said it perfectly. Exactly. It is that broken social contract. And what we have to work towards is finding the common ground that we have. We have it already. We're all afraid. we've all experienced violence.
Yes.
You know, we all have some kind of post-traumatic stress. We all have some kind of moral injury from making the wrong decision. And so we've got to mine that common ground and accept that our experiences specifically are different, but you know, we can understand the emotions that are underlying of them. I interviewed Dr. Jonathan Shea for this book, Charlie.
Love his work. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, just a MacArthur genius. He wrote, you know, Achilles in Vietnam and Oedipus in America, and he said to me specifically, you know, when you put a gun in a young man's hand and you send him to war, you incur a forever debt to his soul. You do. You've changed him. And that doesn't mean putting him on a shelf or building a pedestal and making a statue to him. That means dealing with him as a human being and helping him or her to heal in that process. But also, you share their burden of the war experience. You accept your responsibility in sending them there, but you don't absolve yourself from actually understanding it. You know, and the service person has to meet us halfway as well. They don't want to tell their stories. It's incredibly difficult. It took me 3 years to tease these stories out of, you know, young men and women that I knew. You know, that I've been with, that trusted me. Not, you know, and trust for getting trust with the journalist is not an easy thing, but they knew me, and it still took a very, very long time. You know, my own father, and I mentioned him in the book, never told me his stories. And because of it, I held this kind of misguided thought about him. You know, you read the book, and so you realize I thought he might have participated in a war crime. He hadn't.
Yeah, the picture. If you didn't know anything about the picture that you have, it's true. Yeah.
The picture, you know, for the viewers is my father holding a gun on Japanese prisoners of war. In 1945, he was a young Navy lieutenant, and you know, I thought he might have killed them. But you know, what
do you think? And this kind of leads into my next question here, and is about what do you think is one of the hardest things for veterans to do is to come back and to share their stories in meaningful ways that allow them the opportunity to be able to, you know, get that connection that they need to heal that social contract between them and the civilian world, and to heal from their own experiences. And you know, it's in telling those stories like you have in the book, and you know, you just mentioned how difficult it was to be able to get the guys to be able to talk to you about these things, even after you'd already established trust with them. It still took them a long time. What are the consequences of, you know, the sailors and the airmen and the Marines and the soldiers that come back from combat or from war experiences, and they just bury their suffering, they bury their pain, they don't address their unaddressed guilt because it's there? What are the consequences of veterans not sharing their stories?
That's such a great question. I don't think there is a greater consequence to not sharing stories from conflict, because it means we will perpetuate those conflicts.
Exactly.
We go to war so easily. We almost did with Iran again. I couldn't imagine the next generation of young men and women, and they were willing to do it because they hadn't heard clearly or directly, you know, from those soldiers and Marines that had served, you know, what the experience was. You know, these experiences that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. You know, good experiences in bonding, you know, but terrible experiences in killing and having friends killed, and carrying that with them forever. And quite frankly, it's going to bankrupt the nation. We do owe them a debt for the rest of their natural lives. You know, my father died a couple of years ago. He was in his 90s. He was still getting care at the VA for his service in Vietnam and his service in Korea. And we will owe them their lives, you know, the care for the rest of life, which we should.
Yes.
Probably more than spending, you know, trillions of dollars on a fighter aircraft. But that's what we do owe them. And yet, if you continue to have wars in perpetuity, you will never be able to pay for it. You just won't. I mean, the VA system is already overburdened. And so, yeah, I think that consequences is just we're going to be doomed to repeat history. You know, I think we're already there. I mean, this storytelling has to happen on a larger level.
Yeah.
The things that we were talking about prior to the interview starting, with Ed Tick and Warrior's Heart, going over to Vietnam or going over to these war zones and kind of making peace, coming back and sharing those experiences, with the community actively being a part of it. In the history of warfare, we see warrior societies do that.
Yes.
Native Americans sitting around the campfire, passing the peace pipe, sharing the stories of the conflict. Same thing, the Greeks creating, drama and tragedy and art from their experiences, gives voice to what they've experienced, and perhaps through art, society can understand it better, what they've gone through. And so hopefully that can happen. I don't know, but I'm not overly optimistic.
Well, we haven't had a great track record. I mean, and we have those pockets, and of what you just talked about, the Native Americans and then the ancient Greeks, and being able to use theater as a means to be able to purge and address those deep archetypal wounds. I mean, the guys who wrote those plays were veterans. I mean, they were generals. Two of them were generals, and one of them was a foot soldier. And they built these, but they were trying to achieve that cleansing of the soul, the catharsis that comes from addressing the guilt, the pain, the loss, the act. But you have to address it. We have to, and we're not doing that. And you're right. If we don't do these stories and share them, we're just going to keep perpetuating the same thing over and over again, and that's what ends up happening.
And Charlie, I don't know how you feel about this, and I know it's a really hot button topic, but in some ways I feel we should have the draft. The professional army is remarkable in a lot of ways in what they can accomplish, but I don't think that we share that burden completely. The draft can be non-combat roles, but if we share responsibility for protecting, providing, building our society, then it's more common. I don't know what percentage of veterans are our society. It's very small, though.
It's very small. It's like 1%, I think.
It's tiny.
It's very tiny.
And so until that becomes, more broadly met, I think we are going to have difficulty in true understanding of each other.
Well, one of the soldiers that you interviewed, he fought for the Israeli Defense Force, and I think in Israel everyone is conscripted to be able to, both men and women, to serve in those ways. So they really understand what it is, and so they have a part to play in how their society functions. It's not just at the expense of somebody else, or somebody else carries the burden. Everybody's carrying the burden, and so you know what? That might be a really good idea to reinstitute that in a way, so that everybody takes a share in it, not just a few people.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be just based on combat arms.
No.
It can be anything. It can be like the Peace Corps in some ways, and like the kind of dangers those volunteers face in going to unknown places and experiencing the dangers of those particular areas can be intense. But that will help us in that shared burden of both building and protecting and supporting our society.
Kevin, I can't believe that we're over at the top of the hour. I mean, this went by so fast. I want to keep talking to you for that.
So much to talk about, right?
There's so much to talk about. What do you hope people will take, quickly, just a couple real quick questions. What do you hope people will take away from reading these stories about these modern combatants?
Well, I want them to see them as human, first of all. That they are individuals before they became soldiers. They're people from all walks of life, and that we have lessons to learn, from their lives. There are people that are able to come back successfully despite the struggles that they have, and those stories are in there. But really, one of the things that we didn't talk about a lot, Charlie, is the role that drugs have in conflict. They're a huge part in pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict, very often in negative ways. You and I have both had our experiences in drugs and alcohol in negative ways, trying to self-medicate, after these conflicts. I think there are positive sides to it too. We're seeing new research into MDMA, and also marijuana in helping to treat PTSD. So, drugs and pharmacology can be part of the solution, but not alone. And we can't just medicate with benzodiazepines and alcohol and so on and antidepressants and expect the problem to go away. It won't.
Doesn't.
In fact,
It just makes it worse. Made it worse for me. I mean, it absolutely made it worse for me.
Absolutely. And, in some cases, there are therapeutic aspects of it, but that are not necessarily the embrace. A lot of veterans that I've talked to want marijuana to be, allowed to be distributed within the VA, even though it's against the law federally. A lot of states are accepting it as part of therapeutic, along with talk therapy and CBT as to help heal.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, we're going to close here in just a second. I just want to make a quick, folks, we are doing today and the next, every Friday now, all the way to the 25th of September. This is part of the Veterans Summit, Part 1. The Council has partnered up with the Trauma Sensitive Awareness Foundation to do these special series for veterans and their loved ones and advocates for exploring cutting-edge treatments and alternative therapies, hearing pioneering veterans and mental injury experts and journalists who have been out there and have seen and been in the hot zone, and to find hope for PTS, TBI, moral injury, sleep disturbance, family conflict, emotional trauma, and more. Part 2 debuts in November at www.t-saf.org. That's t-saf.org. Stay tuned for that. Please go. These are going to be for free and available to veterans and their families and their loved ones in perpetuity as long as we can make it. All of this one and the other shows are all going to be available for free for veterans on their website. Want to thank KUHS Denver as well. Thank you, KUHS, and all the people here who have allowed the council to be broadcast from this platform to spread the message of hope and reconciliation and restoration for all people who have suffered from violence, abuse, and trauma and PTS. Thank you, Henry, and everybody here at KUHS. We are the streaming here in Denver, Colorado, all across the nation and all across the world. Thank you for allowing me to be your host. Kevin, I always ask, I thank you so much for joining us on the council today. I always ask my guests right before we close out the show, if you could give one piece of advice, one bit of wisdom from your life experience, what would it be?
Well, it's hard to distill all that down, but I think sharing your story is one of the greatest gifts that you can give. It's instructive and it's also cathartic for you. And so if you have the opportunity to do that and to do it authentically, I would take it, try to.
Well, sir, it has been an honor. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it.
And people can buy the book, The Things They Cannot Say, on your website. Where can they purchase it?
Sure, pretty much anywhere on the web, Amazon. It's available in audio form now. I just did a session with Recorded Books last December, and I believe that's out now. So,
well, thank you. It's a gift to humanity, for humanity, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Great talking with you.
Thank you. All right, folks, thank you so much for tuning into the council today. We are going to be back next week with another fantastic guest here on, the Veteran Summit Series, Part 1 of the Council and the Trauma Sensitive Awareness Foundation Special. Folks, may you all be well. May you all be free of pain and suffering. May you all be whole. God bless. We'll see you next week.